Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for those across the globe. Thank you for joining us today for our second GDPR webinar, where we will talk about GDPR Live, one of the products from Cura. Joining me today, I have Mr. John Giles. John has many years of practical experience in working in the legal industry, and he has a specialty in privacy, data protection, cybersecurity, cybercrime, and the law relating to ICT. And welcome, John. Thank you for coming on board for this one.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to join you. And yeah, I'm very pleased to be here, and welcome to everyone attending.
Great stuff. So in our last webinar, we went through a bit of what GDPR is. What we want to cover today is in a very short time, go through a couple of the questions about things that you may not be aware of with GDPR. So we'd like to encourage everyone as we go through these questions to ask questions of us. You'll have a questions panel in the webinar where you can send through a question and we will try our best to answer it. We are on some limited time today, so we will also offer a direct email address where you can contact me with any questions you may have after this webinar, and we can take it from there for some advisory or how we can help you. First things first, I'd like to put a bit of a poll forward as to some of the topics that we have today and to see which topics are most relevant to you. So if you take a look on your screen, there should be a poll coming up now. If everyone can please just pop a couple of comments in there. Okay, I see we're starting to get our answers coming in there. Alrighty, let's give it a few more seconds for everyone to vote. Okay, it is looking as though we have quite a leaning along to who must comply, and followed by the can you be GDPR certified and how the GDPR is enforced. Great, so we will spend a bit of time on those ones for you. And yeah, let's jump in without further ado. Okay, so the first question on our list is who must comply with the GDPR? And this is quite an interesting one, and we do see a lot of this question coming through. And I think it boils down to a few topics that you can ask yourself. John, can you perhaps give us a bit of a guideline on this one?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to help. I think the first point that's really interesting and I found quite entertaining is that when Mark Zuckerberg was appearing before the Senate recently, one of the journalists took a photograph of his notes that were in front of him. And so it was interesting in that it was things that he didn't necessarily say, but that he had a record of notes of what he should say. And one of the points was, if they ask you whether Facebook complies with the GDPR, say no, or do not say that Facebook complies with the GDPR. So I found that very interesting, and it's an issue that I think a lot of Americans are dealing with at the moment is whether or not they have to comply, and indeed people around the world are struggling with this issue. And what we often find is that many people think they don't have to comply when in fact they do have to comply. And we've done various sessions where the audience, often it's about 30% of the people think they have to comply. And by the end of the session, we realize that it's actually closer to about 80% of the people have to comply. So it's a trend around the world that people outside of the EU think they don't have to, but indeed they actually do because of the exceptionally broad jurisdictional scope and territorial scope that GDPR has.
I think that's quite an interesting point, and I think one of the things that we come across quite a bit is how the GDPR is going to be enforced over the water, which is one of our topics that we're going to discuss a bit later in this webinar. I see we have got a question that has come through with regards to who must comply to the GDPR, and it's asking, how does the GDPR compliance affect South African-based companies? And I know we receive quite a few questions about that as well, because there's the South African laws and there's GDPR. So how would that GDPR compliance affect us over here?
Okay, yes. So it's a very detailed topic. So very quickly, the first question you have to ask yourself is, are we established in the EU? And so if you are, let's say, for example, a South African company and you're not established, you don't have a registered entity there, then you don't need to comply. But if you've got an agent in the EU or you've got a representative there, then that is also regarded as you're established in the union. So don't think it's just a case of having a registered entity there. If you have some sort of presence there, then you must comply. And then even if you don't have that, if you offer goods or services to people in the EU, then you must comply. And so again, using the South African example, you might be a South African company, but you might have a price list on your website that includes euros, or there's something on your website that clearly shows that you are hoping for business from the EU. You would also then have to comply with the GDPR. And then finally, if you are a South African entity and you monitor the behavior of people in the EU, then you're also going to have to comply with the GDPR. So it is many South African organizations and in lots of other countries outside of the EU don't yet realize that they actually do have to comply with the GDPR.
Yeah, I must say it was quite interesting. I was speaking at a conference recently overseas, and it was fascinating to note that a lot of the delegates from a lot of the countries there outside of the EU didn't really know that the GDPR is coming. So it was quite surprising to me and quite an interesting experience to have to explain it, seeing as though we're seeing such noise about it at the moment. I think what you mentioned in your second point there as to who must comply, I'd just like to dive into that in perhaps a little bit more detail, is what classifies as targeting EU customers. You mentioned if you're aiming, and you mentioned having price lists on your website. Is that taking, what's the bit of the nuances around that?
Sure. So there's, the first thing is, even if you're offering free goods or services to Europeans, then you must comply. So if you've got an app that's free and you're planning on monetizing it in some way down the line later on, that would be an example where you are offering goods or services to people in the EU. And then the other is, if you are envisaging offering goods or services, so it's not, you don't have to be offering or even providing it. It's only if you're envisaging, then you must comply. So if you use a language that's used in the EU, so maybe part of your website is in French, or you are targeting, I forget what they're called in Google, but when you've got a domain which is /fr or / a particular country, that would also give it away. Exactly, yes. And then also if you mention customers or users in the EU, so if you gave a case study of a customer that's using your services and they're based in the EU, would also be giving it away that you are envisaging offering goods or services to people in the EU.
Okay. I know we had a discussion previously, John, around the fact that the GDPR and a lot of the impression that I had previously when I was still learning about GDPR was that it only affected EU citizens. But we had a rather interesting discussion the other day about it more tying it to residents. Can you give us a bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So the key is that it's about protecting people that are in the EU. So if an EU citizen comes to South Africa and you provide goods or services to an EU citizen in South Africa, then you don't have to comply with the GDPR. It's only if it's providing goods or services to people in the EU. And it doesn't need to only be an EU citizen. It could be an EU resident. Effectively, what the GDPR is trying to do is to protect people who are in the EU.
Okay, so even if you're a South African that has gone over and you're a resident of the EU, it then applies to you.
Correct, yes.
Just wanted to check in here. Do we have any questions so far on the topics that we have covered in brief detail so far? I just see there are some coming. While those are coming in, I think let's carry on. Guys, please keep your questions coming. We will go through them as we go through the sections. So, John, we've spoken now about what classifies as targeting the EU customers, the residents, and who must comply. What does compliance mean to the GDPR?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic that lots of people are asking at the moment. And so if you look at the GDPR, it's really broken down into three components. There are principles you must comply with. There are some obligations that controllers and processors must comply with. And then there are some rights of data subjects that you must enable them to exercise. So when it comes to your obligations, to an extent, it's a tick box exercise of have we complied with these obligations? Although there is quite a lot of application that needs to happen. When it comes to the principles, you have to analyze your activities and then work out how you are lawfully processing based on the principles. So when it comes to the principles in particular, it's very hard to ever get to the point where you say we 100% comply with the GDPR. And the analogy we use is that it's a little bit like personal fitness. So I want to be fit. I recognize the benefits of it, and I'm continually trying to be fit. I do press-ups every second day. I run 5 kilometers on the weekend, and I'm trying to be fit. But at different points in time, I'm going to be fitter than others, and I'm never going to succeed, and I'll never be 100% fit. And that's very much the same way that data protection compliance works. And so don't strive for 100% compliance, because you can't achieve that.
That's interesting. So it is a continual effort that you need to do and monitor, and having accountability and that responsibility to do so. I see we have got another question coming in regarding the UK. We will get to that, I think, when we cover how the GDPR is enforced over the waters. I think I'll bring it in nicely on that one. John, something that we have seen a bit of on our side as well is people asking like whether you can become certified for GDPR. And I see this was one of the questions that folks put through in the poll as being one of the really relevant topics to the guys. So can you become GDPR certified? Do you get a seal of approval?
Yes, it is. It's a very topical issue, and many people ask it. What the GDPR has done is created the framework for certifications. So authorities in the future will certify a particular certifying body as someone who is able to certify compliance, and then that body will issue a certification. The key thing, though, at the moment is that not a single body in the world has been accredited or certified to be able to issue certifications. And so it is not possible at the moment to become GDPR certified. It doesn't exist, and you can't obtain one. So if someone's saying to you, I've got this or this product that's going to make you GDPR certified, they're lying, because it's not. It's not possible.
Okay, that is good to know. Tying onto this and moving forward to our next topic, because I see there's a few questions coming through on it. How is the GDPR enforced? I mean, we get a few people who've asked us about the GDPR live solution, asking, we're in South Africa or we're in Australia, and we're not in the EU, so how is someone honestly going to come and enforce it on us? Can you give us some insight into how that enforcement is going to take place?
Yeah, sure. So let's say you're in South Africa and clearly you have to comply with POPIA, and you've registered your information officer with the information regulator. So they clearly have a line to you in the case of non-compliance with POPIA. So then you also have to comply with the GDPR. And if you've determined that you must comply, you then have to appoint a representative in the EU. You may also have to appoint a data protection officer who doesn't have to be in the EU, but not everyone needs a data protection officer or a DPO. But if you do have to appoint someone, then you've got that person as well. So the idea around the representative is that a regulator or authority in the EU would be able to contact that representative and say, I want you to come and appear before us, and I want to talk to you about whatever's happened. But then if, for example, you did contravene the GDPR and they wanted to fine you, so let's say the authority in Spain wants to fine you, the way they will make it happen is through networks and through agreements between authorities. And there are two key bodies that have been established and operate here. The one is called the International Conference of DPAs, or Data Protection Authorities, and the other is called GPEN, or the General Privacy Enforcement Network. And essentially what the regulators have done is they've entered into agreements to cooperate, so that if the Spanish regulator wants to fine you, they would then contact the South African information regulator, and the regulator here would almost execute that fine on their behalf. So I'm afraid you're not going to escape. It's they're going to catch you one way or another.
Yeah, that sounds about right. We have a few questions coming through on particularly how the GDPR is enforced. And just given what you've said now with Spain and South Africa, how does GDPR affect the UK and cover the UK considering Brexit?
Yeah, it's obviously a very interesting issue because of Brexit happening sort of in the middle of the GDPR grace period. And essentially what's happened is that the UK have published a bill called the Data Protection Bill. And this bill is going to replace the current UK Data Protection Act. And essentially what that bill does is it introduces the GDPR and then some extra compliance requirements. So in other words, that bill really puts us in a position that the UK is the same as though they had stayed in the EU. They've basically done so. For example, Germany has enacted some auxiliary laws to the GDPR, and the UK has done a similar thing. So really, there's no difference. The UK, it's as though they're still in the EU from a data protection perspective.
Okay, that's great. So then some of the other questions coming through, when do we think that the regulators will start asking for things like a compliance report? Would that be something that you'd only have to provide if someone complained, or would there be a regular audit or something like that? How do you foresee it happening, or is it too early to tell?
Yeah, no, this webinar is talking about things you might not know about the GDPR. And one of a very important secret is that is that virtually nobody complies and will be in a position to say we comply by 25 May. We interact with lots of organizations, and much like we saw with Facebook, I would say there are very, very few organizations in the world who honestly would be prepared to put their hand up and say we comply. They might put on a brave face, but they really don't comply. There's a lot of work to be done. And one of the key insights that I gained from Dr. Bottarelli, who is the head of the European supervisor for GDPR, was that he said that he's going to be encouraging authorities not to come hard at controllers, that authorities will.
Oh, John, I think we're losing you a little bit here. Apologies, folks. I think we are having a little bit of a technical difficulty.
Trying to sue controllers who are in contravention.
John, you're back. I think we may have lost you for a moment there on audio. Apologies. Could I ask you to
sorry
repeat?
about that. Sure. So when did you lose me?
I think it was going up and down a little bit. You'd spoken about the doctor that you'd spoken to, and that it wouldn't really be coming down entirely or coming down hard.
Yes. So the key point is that authorities are not going to take a heavy-handed approach after 25 May. Instead, they are going to want to see that a controller is working towards compliance and is doing something and can prove that they're doing something. And as long as that's the case, then they will work with you. But it's also, data protection law generally is reactive in nature. So really, it's up to you to do what you have to do. And then if somebody complains or a regulator approaches you because they want to approach you, then you have to prove that you have been doing the right things. It's reactive really in nature.
Okay, I think that ties into a bit of one of the other questions we've received here, which is, can we get fined for non-compliance even if we don't have a data breach? I suppose with things being a bit reactive, it may be a case of you wouldn't necessarily be investigated for that unless you had one and someone reported a breach. Or how do you see that playing out, John?
Sorry, Ross, I lost quite a bit of that. I didn't hear the beginning, but I think you were asking around breaches and how that would play out.
Yeah, the question that we've received is can someone get fined for non-compliance even if there is no breach?
Yeah, I mean, a breach very much relates to information security and that aspect of data protection. But data protection is a lot broader than that. And so certainly you could not have a breach, a bit like in this Facebook example with Cambridge Analytica. It was not a breach, but it's almost certainly was an unlawful processing of personal information. So certainly you could be fined even if you don't have a breach.
So it's vitally important then, I think, that you manage your data privacy. I know we take data privacy very, very seriously, and it's an ongoing management exercise. We want to avoid it and not get caught at the end of it. The last question we've got on the GDPR enforcement is there some sort of status that we would need to show on our website in order to do business with EU companies? I would imagine that that's an on request, but would that be something that would make business easier if you had to put forward an advertisement that you are complying with your GDPR?
Yeah, so this is particularly relevant to where you are a processor for a controller in the EU. And so there are scenarios where you are, let's say in South Africa, and you are providing goods or services and you're processing personal data for somebody in the EU. So you don't have to comply, but your customer has to comply, and they are a controller. They are going to be very hesitant to use you and to continue to do business with you unless you are GDPR compliant. And they will probably then ask for you to agree that you will be or are GDPR compliant. So you definitely want to be saying that you're working hard towards it and make strong statements, but I would caution you against, don't say that you are certified GDPR compliant 100%, because any controller who knows their oaths is going to realize that you're bluffing, because you can't be certified and you can't be 100% compliant. So you want to be demonstrating that you take data protection really seriously and that you've done a lot for it and will continue to do so. But don't advertise that you're certified or 100% compliant.
Okay, great. So something that we see coming through quite a bit, and I've seen it in some of the forums and perhaps even in some of the advertising of GDPR solutions, is that it seems to come across in a lot of times that GDPR is simply an IT problem, and the IT department are the guys that need to sort out our GDPR compliance and our data security. Now, in my view, coming from just a sort of general management side, is I can see in the business between our support desk and things like that GDPR wouldn't necessarily just be an IT problem. To me, it spans across the entire business. Would you agree with that assessment? What are your thoughts on that?
Definitely. IT have a very important role to play in data protection from various perspectives, but it certainly is not just an IT problem. It spans the business. And to give you a couple of examples, the GDPR requires organizations to protect their employee information and to deal with it in a certain way. So the HR department has a big role to play. In many organizations, IT doesn't own the data, it's business who owns the actual data. And so, data governance is a very important issue, but if it's marketing and sales and they have the customer lists and prospect lists, really they should own that data. And data protection law has a huge impact on how they can market, particularly with direct marketing. So it really is a business-wide issue that impacts on all areas. It's not just an IT issue.
Fascinating. John, I see we don't seem to have any more questions that have come in. Are there any other questions from our attendees at this time? I'll give that a few more seconds, but while we're waiting for that, John, should there be no more questions, I'd like to just thank you for your time. It's been a fantastic insight having you in here and giving us some info here. And folks on the attendees list, as you can probably gather from this, there's quite a bit to be done for GDPR and to look after your GDPR compliance in your organization. So the question is, we've gone through what it is, and one of the questions that comes out is, how are you going to comply with it? So spreadsheets are a way to do it, but we don't believe that's the most effective way of doing things. And I'd like to take just the last few minutes to introduce you to a bit of a product that Cura has brought out at a very, very high level. I see we're not getting any additional questions. So John, thank you very, very much for helping us in these questions and this discussion that we've had.
It's a pleasure. It's great to be with you.
Great. So from our side at Cura, we have something that we have launched called GDPR Live. And GDPR Live is a system. We've spoken about the principles that you need to comply with, the obligations, and something that struck out for me in this conversation that we've had today is the fact that we need accountability and responsibility. So we have our system, and we pride ourselves in being visual about our GDPR compliance. So GDPR Live, just on a very high level, gives you a visual indicator as to your compliance, what you need to do on a continuous basis, what you need to do on a once-off basis, and also monitoring what sort of personal information you have in your organization. Are you looking after account numbers? Do you have special personal information? It's all things you need to know as an organization across the organization. We spoke about HR having a responsibility. We can now assign that responsibility to HR. So from these dashboards, we can say what's going to cost us the most to comply, what's going to cost us the least, what's most important for us, and we can manage our GDPR across the business. And we are approaching time. We said we'd be 30 minutes, and we are quite bang on the money there. So if there are any additional questions, please by all means ask them now. Alternatively, you are welcome to email me directly. It's ross@curasoftware.com. And I'll be happy to field your questions or be able to refer you to someone like John at Michalsons. And I'd like to really thank John for his insight into this. We couldn't have done it without him. And we are quite proud to have Michalsons with us on this and be able to tell us about these kind of interview questions and things like that, where we may not know exactly what this GDPR involves, and it's great to have some advisory on that. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, and stay tuned for the details of our next webinar. We will release those in the next couple of weeks, and we will dive into a bit more of the details in GDPR and what you need to do after the 25th of May. How do you stay compliant? What's the steps from here? Where do we go from here? So thank you everyone for attending. It was great having you with us. We will see you next time.